We've been talking about contentment, and we've learned some things about it. We've learned, first of all, that contentment is something that we have to learn and be instructed in and grow in as we walk with Jesus Christ. We've learned that godliness with contentment is great gain. We've learned that if we aren't content, we'll never be satisfied. Doesn't matter how much we have, just constantly more and more and more. And we have learned that contentment comes from a daily walk with Jesus Christ. Today, we're going to talk about contentment and the power of God in our lives. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, the Apostle Paul tells us that he got caught up into the third heaven, to paradise. And he heard some incredible things that he was not permitted to repeat. And the Bible tells us in verse 7, unless I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. And he tells us twice there that the reason for this was that he not be exalted above measure. In other words, that he wouldn't be puffed up with pride because of the revelations that he had. So he had seen some things from heaven, and he wasn't permitted to go around bragging and telling everybody about those. And so to keep him humble, God permitted this thorn in the flesh. And there's been lots of speculation as to what that was. Not real sure, but he tells us point blank it was a messenger of Satan to buffet him, or to beat him, to cause him to be held back in a way. And he goes on and he says, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. He prayed and said, God, please remove this. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now the word translated sufficient is exactly the same Greek word that's translated content in the other passages of Scripture we've looked at earlier this week. So we can learn something really important here. Contentment means that what we have from God is sufficient. And in this case, he tells Paul, my grace is sufficient. It is enough. God's grace is enough. It doesn't matter what you face. God's grace is enough. It is sufficient. It is satisfactory. And when we learn that, when we recognize that, then we can go on to this place where Paul said that he had gotten to. Now listen to this. He says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities. That means my weaknesses. That the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Now, this is an incredible realization that Paul comes to here. But this is what contentment is about. Paul says, God's grace is where strength and power come from. And God's grace is enough. It's always enough. Doesn't matter what we face. God's grace is enough. And so he says, when I get into distresses for Christ's sake, when I get persecuted for the cause of Christ, when I'm out preaching and I get thrown in jail, I rejoice in that. Why? Because when I'm weak, then am I strong. You see, he's the strong one, and the strength comes from him. I just want to encourage you this morning. God's grace is sufficient. The reason that we can be content in life is because Jesus has promised to never leave us and never forsake us. Godliness with contentment is great gain. The things that this world says are so valuable and important in God's economy really don't matter. What matters is our walk with Christ, our relationships with other people. What matters is the character transformation that's taking place in our lives. And I just want to encourage you this morning. I don't know what you're going through, but I guarantee you God's grace is enough. So let's trust him, and let's expect for him to show up in our moments of weakness and to be strong on our behalf. God bless. Have a great day.